Welcome back, artists. I'm Waiya Paints, and today, SuperShark urged me to pilfer my laundry money to take on this week's classic arcade character, the one and only Ryu from Street Fighter. While it has been a few years from my arcade days, SuperShark slid me a few rolls of quarters and became today's sponsor. And lucky me, this is going to be an easy peasy straightforward project, as it's a clean sculpt with some nice texture, and it isn't overloaded with a bunch of extra things to paint. While sometimes that fluff is the bee's knees, sometimes you just want a simple design that gives you some wiggle room to grow and enjoy the hobby. And because I'm curious, I'd like you all to leave a comment below with your favorite Street Fighter game. But just so you know, the only acceptable answers are going to be MVC2, Street Fighter 3 Third Impact, and because I'm that crazy guy, Street Fighter Cross Taken. And if you say Street Fighter the movie, the game, just go. Just go. And I don't even think that's a hot take. That's just the take. That's just the take. That's the take. While I love the movie, a game based off the movie, based off the game, that's just a step too far, even for me. But we can have that debate in the comments. I've got to get cracking on Ryu. So, meet me over at the painting table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. I'm going to start this one off like I usually do, with the base. And this one's nice and Spartan, with a nice solid brick street surrounded by a cloud relief. My first color here is going to be ash gray. This is for the grout between the bricks. With a detail like this, you always want to paint it first. If you wait until after the bricks are done, you'll have a heck of a time trying to paint it cleanly, which is going to lead to a ton of time used in cleanup and most likely a very messy final look. So I'd rather it look messy now when it doesn't matter, so long as it gives me a strong foundation to build from so it'll look great later. I did go in and give him a second pass to try to get it as vibrant as I can, as it will get darkened and dirtied later. For the bricks, this very old bottle of fresh blood will do just fine. Now you're going to notice the very thin coverage I get with this red, which is to be expected as red and yellows are notorious for this. So as you can guess, this is going to take multiple coats to get full opacity. Thankfully, these are very pronounced bricks, so they'll be easy to paint within the lines. You just are going to have to fight against the tediousness of it, but like with any boring painting section, the best advice is just to put on a movie or a podcast and just lock in until you get it done. The real time eater here is going to be getting all the edges of the bricks, and if you're not that well versed in catching short edges with the tip of your brush, here's your opportunity to practice. You can leave them gray, but the grout will look wide and uneven and ultimately give the appearance of poorly done mason work, which could be a look you're going for. But here, I want a well-made street that's been damaged, so it's going to take the extra time. After about 4 applications, my bricks were finally starting to look the part, and with the edges of the bricks done, it had a much more sophisticated look. Next up, Angel Green. While I said this is a cloud relief, I went with green as I've seen these made in jade, and I felt with the lighter colors of the main statue, having darker tones in the base will help highlight it. But the one thing I was worried about is making the base feel too Christmassy with the combo of red and green. But with the darker green here and the bands that are going to separate it from the bricks, that should be enough to avoid it. Time for a null and oil shade. I want an all-over wash here, but I don't want to do this too heavy or it's going to muddy up the colors too much. So while I'm using a floofy brush for this, I'm not using very much wash and spreading it as far as it will go. I can always add another pass if I want it darker, so it's better to exercise that control and not undo the nice work I've put in. With the shade all dry, it was time to use this bright camo green. This went on using a medium dry brush to brighten and bring out the design of the clouds. Here I'm only using a bi-directional dry brush, meaning I'm stroking in only 2 directions, left to right. When you dry brush, typically your paint load gets deposited on the leading perpendicular edge, So using a left-right stroke ensures even application on both the left and right edges. And with a medium load on my brush, it'll also get some deposited across the top surfaces as well. The main point of doing this is to have very little paint left on the top and bottom edges, which I plan on handling next. Now to handle that top edge, a bit of snakeskin. Here I'm using a very light dry brush, using strokes strictly from the top down. As previously explained, this will deposit paint on the top leading edge, but without the bottom to top stroke, it leaves the bottom edges darker. This way, I get a nice soft overhead lighting effect with just a bit of planning and very little effort. Time to highlight those bricks with vermilion. Since I have so much area to cover here, I switched over to my big floofy brush for a super light and even application, but I needed to ensure all the edges were addressed evenly. So for ease, I kept all my strokes aligned with the bricks and then turned it 90 degrees and repeated. The important thing to remember here is to start the sweep across the bricks from off the base. This will minimize the chances of any straight hairs falling in between the bricks and gunking up all the nice grout work. Finally, a touch of mythical orange as a final pop of highlight. I kept this as whisper soft as I could to prevent making the bricks too orangey. I only want a ghost of a highlight so that the edges get nice and crispy. 30 seconds tops, and then time to move on. Next up, rings of greedy gold. In keeping with the goal of not having the base look too Christmassy, giving the bands around the base a gilding of gold helps separate the colors. And really, you can pretty much use any metallic here, but I would avoid silvers as they can move the piece closer to that Yuletide color scheme. Whatever metallic you use, just don't forget to thin down your paint. A chunky metal ring here will throw off the look of our good work. With that, the base is done, and so far, this project is starting to get me hyped. But I'm not gonna lax, it's time to extend this combo and move on to his pants. Now here we can start making some choices, as Ryu has kinda worn slightly different pants over the years, and we can put this in a range of warm creams to slightly bluish bright whites. But specifically, this Ryu is based on the Street Fighter V characterization, so I'm gonna be going with the dingy gray, starting with the ash gray that I used earlier. I'm so glad Street Fighter V had great pants because I really didn't want to paint these white. Not only is it a pain to paint white well, but also like anything white, it gets dirty on a shelf very fast. So hopefully going with this gray will help keep the model looking good on my shelf without needing a daily dusting. So definitely a win-win. And since these pants are very plain, fitting in with Ryu's sense of style, 2 thin coats to the base was all it needed to move on to shading. And if we're shading, we're probably going to be using our friend Nullen Oil. The first thing I did was shade the seams and the major folds. Then I wanted to add a few stains here and there, because while this Ryu is nicknamed Homeless Ryu, he's always kind of been homeless since the first Street Fighter, and judging by the tattered fabric, these pants have seen a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So in a way, I want them to look like they stink of that street life. You can get creative with this and add different colors for stains, but you really want to reserve yourself and stick to at most 3 colors, and your best friends are going to be black, brown, and green. Being heavy-handed or using too many colors here can start to make it look too busy and forced, so I opted to just stick with a basic black. Now with the oil dry, I want these stains to look set in and not so pronounced, so I went back over the pants with a light dry brush of the ash gray. This will help blend in the hard edges of the shading and start to fade in our stains so they look older, like they've been through the wash a few times. I did leave a bit more of the oil showing towards the bottom of the legs, as these well-soiled areas should look nice and grungy. Now for a touch of spaceship exterior. This was a super light dry brush, focused mainly on the top edge of his pants and the front top panels. This will help tiptoe the pants closer to that iconic white without the headache of painting white. But since I'm still aiming for that vagabond look, all I want to do is tiptoe. So super light and super disciplined about where I put it. Now for hardened carapace for his black belt. While I do know this is technically a very dark brown, against all this gray, it'll read as black fairly well. Nothing too tricksy here, just paint smooth and stay within the lines. For the embroidered kanji, it's time to break out my detail brush and get focused. Best advice is to use very little paint on your brush and slowly trace over it multiple times. And this is one of those times I like my paint on the thick side, so no thinning. A thicker paint won't flow out as fast on you, but you still don't want to overload your brush either. You should still see your brush coming to a sharp point. If it doesn't, touch your brush to your hand to wick off the excess until you can see the point. With the pants all done, I figured this is a great spot to take a few seconds and thank my subscribers over on Patreon. The painting pantheon has been steadily growing week after week, and I cannot express how grateful I am to you. You truly have my gratitude. If you would like your name etched into the halls of greatness, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. Or you can support the channel right here on YouTube by liking and subscribing. That, along with watching, is the #1 way to train the YouTube algorithm that this guy is worth looking at. I also want to take a moment to give a thank you to today's sponsor, SuperShark. They've been a longtime supporter of the channel, and they make it super easy for me to say yes, because they just keep on churning out bangers. If you want to get your hands on this Ryu or many other top tier sculpts, be sure to check out their Patreon link in the description as well. Hopefully, you'll find your next project. But for now, round 2 is about to start, and I feel a perfect ultra combo finisher coming on. So let's get back to finish Ryu. To get us going on his skin, I went with plain old flesh. I was kind of digging the sideshow skin method, so I want to take another stab at it before I revert back to my usual skin recipe. But I do want to experiment a bit with it, and I'll touch on that a bit later. For now, it's all about getting even opaque coverage, and getting that over black will take many coats. So don't be alarmed with how the first one goes on. I expect this to take about 5 or 6 coats before it looks good. If you find that you're putting it on in 1 or 2 coats, it's probably a sign you need to thin your paints more. It's movie time again, because you want a good 10-15 minutes between each coat for drying. Otherwise, you risk ripping up the semi-dry layers and getting a chunky surface texture. Also, a floofy makeup brush helps to get in the tighter places of the hands and feet, and even if I have to commit a bit of brush abuse to get it done, I really don't mind, as these brushes are hella cheap and get them in a set for about 10 bucks. And as you can see, after 6 very thin coats, I had a nice even skin tone with no chunky paint texture. Once it was fully dry, it was time for a staining wash. This time, only using dark red tone. I applied this using the sideshow method of an all-over wash followed by sponging. While I enjoyed the multifaceted shading of using the blue, red, yellow triad, I wanted to simplify the process. And while cutting it down to one color lessened the complexity, I still opted for multiple applications to get the depth I was looking for. But just be sure to check for pooling by literally lifting the model up and looking from underneath. If you just turn over your model, the pooling will just move around to the lowest point, keeping it hidden from view. And it's a hell of a burn to come back to a dry model and finding a silly pool of dried wash on an elbow. 10 seconds of due diligence now will save you an hour of repaints later. As an extra tip, when dabbing off the wash from the hands and face, don't be afraid to leave small pools gathered in key places, like between the fingers and the folds around the eyes. Kind of the whole point of this method is to get those areas shaded. In fact, I had to give the face and hands 2 extra passes to get them the way I wanted it. Next, I mixed in a bit of scar tissue to the flesh to get a nice hue for his nipples. If I gotta paint them nipples, they're gonna be some nice nipples. After that, I went back over the skin with some thinned down flesh to push back some of the shading from areas that really didn't make sense, like the tops of his pectorals. I also wanted to bring out better details in his hands and feet. Which ended up keying me in on just how jacked up Ryu's feet are. Dude's got calluses on his toe knuckles. Like, bro, if your feet are this jacked up, you should totally be wearing some closed-toed shoes. Seriously, dude, your feet are gross. I'm trying to eat. Still working on his feet, I gave each toe a solid wash of the dark red around the nails for a bit of bruising. This was followed by a touch of cobalt skin to finish off the nails. Next, I felt the face could use a bit more attention, so I did some extra detail shading in some key areas around his ears and brow, just to really push the contrast higher for better readability, followed by a bit of cleanup with flesh tone to re-brighten those key highlight areas. Time to go finish off those feet with some rich leather. The first step here is basing the sandals and straps, and from now on, the fun and fast painting phase is over. For the rest of this project, it's going to require clean painting to not jank it up. So take your time and get 2 coats. Then I gave the sandals a wash in light tone. Just be sure to keep control over this wash and not gunk up the skin we worked so hard on. Now to highlight the wood grain with a bit of khaki. You know the drill. This is clean detail painting, so repeat the mantra. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. All you need is a single stroke for each raised edge of the wood grain, and before you know it, Ryu will have a nice pair of worn sandals for his little hobbit feet. Moving up to his gloves, I broke out the fresh blood again to tie it in with the base. And like with the bricks, this is going to take about 3 or 4 coats to get full coverage over the black. But unlike them, we won't be highlighting to orange here, as I want to keep these looking very old. But they will need a touch of dark red shade along the seams and the rips, but just a touch. I want these to look like basic, simple, generic gloves. Jumping up into his hair, once again, we could make some crazy choices, as when it comes to character designs in Street Fighter, even with the face of their franchise, Capcom has been very inconsistent. Ryu's hair has ranged from red, brown, all the way to black. I'm opting for black here because again, this one's based on Street Fighter V, but I don't want to go pure black, so I'm going to be mixing in just a dab of gray. That way, it'll be around the darkness of his belt and read just as black as it needs to be. Because as a general rule, you don't really want to use pure black or pure white. So just a dab will do. But this is when I realized I should do the headband now, as for some reason, it passes underneath his eyebrows. Which I gotta say is anime as hell, and I love it. But it needed to be painted first, so I got a quick coat of red before I finished off the rest of his hair. Now, his eyes are another multiple choice spot, as Capcom has been all over the place on this one too. They've been black, brown, gray, and in the MVC series, they were blue. But I think blue eyes would look a little unbalanced with all the darker tones I'm using, so I went with black. And it has nothing to do with how much easier it is to paint. For the wraps around his torso, I used Graveyard Bone. It's a nice cream that looks good next to the gray without getting lost against the pale skin. And for a bit of weathering, I thinned down some light tone, almost like some sweat staining. Once the shade was set, I gave it a light dry brushing of the graveyard to clean up the edges and add to the visual fidelity. The final accessory to paint here is his duffel bag, and typically this is a white or gray that goes along with his gi, but I wanted a darker color to help balance out the lighter ones already present, so I opted for this olive drab green. Not only is it a stereotypical color for a rucksack, it's a well desaturated hue, so it won't stick out, and actually seems more grounded and practical. While this green won't need much weathering, it does need some. So just like the pants, a bit of Nolan oil down the seams and a bit under each of the major folds will do fine. And again, like the pants, a light dry brush application of the base color feathers out the edges of the shadows. For the final detail, rich leather and light tone based and shaded the ropes binding the bag and the ones extending from his hand. After that, it was just a matter of gluing him up and calling it done. And BAM! I gotta say, he came out great. The colors are nice, the washes on his skin came out great, and the darkness around the eyes really gives the impression that Ryu has even started skipping sleep in order to fight. If you told me this guy was walking around the world beating the crap out of people, I would 100% believe you. If I had to be critical about this sculpt, it'd only be for the cuts on the rope and the tassels on his headband. Both were a bit issues with placement of the cuts, but these are personal preferences and are kind of nitpicky. Overall, this is a grade A sculpt. If you want to get your hands on this Ryu, be sure to head on over to the SuperShark Patreon. That way you can support the artists you like so they can afford to keep on cranking out amazing work. As usual, I've got to get working on the next project, so I'm gonna have to leave you. But as always, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process. Perfect Ultra Combo Finisher!